You think the story of the Medellin cartel fits entirely inside a single name. You picture Pablo Escobar standing on a rooftop, the hidden stashes overflowing with cash, the voice of the boss giving orders that crossed an entire continent, and you assume that one man did it all alone. But the most feared empire of the 20th century was not built by one person. It was built, sustained, and defended by 5 men whose names almost nobody remembers, even though without them Pablo would never have become Pablo. This is the story of Escobar's 5 most trusted men. And by the end, you'll understand that this empire was never the plan of a lone genius, but a chain of loyalties that broke apart link by link. One of them is the only one still alive, nearly blind, surviving on almost nothing, ignored by a world that profits from the family name. And decades after everything collapsed, a few words from his own bloodline reopened a case that had been closed in a United States court. His story closes this video, and it's the one that explains why the Escobar name is still marked 30 years later. Popeye, the enforcer who confessed. Before he ever carried a weapon for the most wanted man on the planet, Jairo Velásquez was driving a beauty queen's car. That woman was Pablo's lover, and when the relationship ended, Velásquez was left with no job and no future. So he did something few men dared. He stood in front of the boss and offered him a deal that sounded like a threat. "I know where your stashes are," he told him. "Either you give me work or you eliminate me." Escobar, instead of taking offense, saw in that nerve the raw material of a loyal soldier. He hired him that same afternoon. That is how the most publicized hitman in Colombia's criminal history was born. A career that started with a single sentence. Velásquez was no amateur with a pistol. He turned homicide into a method, almost a cold doctrine that he repeated without blinking. He used to say that a true professional always aims from the eyebrows up, and that anyone aiming lower didn't deserve the trade. He recalled his first victim with the calm of a surgeon, a bus driver he approached almost as a trial assignment, and he insisted that after the shot he felt absolutely nothing. "The theory that you can't sleep after taking a life," he would repeat, "never worked on me." He wasn't only an enforcer. He organized, coordinated, and distributed orders and money among the younger gunmen who hoped to inherit his position. He was the gear that translated the boss's will into concrete facts. Fear for him was simply a working tool. It's worth clearing up something the myth has distorted for years. Newspapers crowned him as the supreme chief of the cartel's gunmen, but the reality of the hierarchy was far more complex. Above him there were other names with more command, more seniority, and more direct trust from the boss, men whom even Popeye obeyed without question. He himself would later admit it without false modesty in his long confessions. He was an important commander inside the machinery, but neither the only one nor the first. What truly made him famous was not sitting at the top, but surviving long enough to tell everything in vivid detail once the others had already fallen silent underground. While the real bosses fell one after another, he learned the art of lasting, and lasting in that trade was almost a miracle. What made Popeye different from the rest wasn't only his aim, but an almost blind devotion to the boss. He followed him everywhere, slept when Pablo slept, ate what Pablo ate, and would have walked straight into an ambush just to carry out one of his orders. That dog-like loyalty was exactly what elevated him inside the organization. In a world where hesitation cost you your life, a man incapable of wavering was worth more than 10 better-trained experts. Pablo understood that from the beginning, and that's why he kept him at his side through the most violent years of the war against the state. When the cartel decided to take on the entire government to stop extradition to the United States, Velásquez was on the front line of that offensive. His devotion was, at the same time, his greatest virtue and his sentence. The numbers surrounding his name are hard to process. He confessed to having eliminated between 250 and 300 people with his own hands, and to having coordinated close to 3,000 more homicides throughout the war. To grasp the scale, picture it this way. If each of those 3,000 people took a seat, they would completely fill a large theater, row after row, all the way to the last seat on the top balcony. He was at the heart of the assassination of presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galán in August of 1989. He took part in the elimination of police commander Valdemar Franklin Quintero, and in the kidnappings of public figures, among them the future president Andrés Pastrana. His signature was on some of the darkest episodes of that decade, and he never tried to hide it. In those years, Medellin turned into an open battlefield where a life was worth less than an order. Popeye himself would later describe that period with numbers that freeze the blood. Hundreds of police officers gunned down in the streets. Thousands of young men on the cartel's side fallen. An entire city turned at once into a recruiting ground for gunmen and into a cemetery. For him, that wasn't a tragedy, but a trade he mastered better than anyone. Shoot fast, don't miss, and leave no trace were, in his own words, the only rules that truly mattered. He was close to the major strikes with which the cartel brought the country to its knees in its fight against extradition. Episodes that left the Colombian state paralyzed for months on end. Every explosion, every mass funeral, every front page reinforced the dark legend of that man who would later smile in front of the cameras. The city learned to fear a cartoon nickname. But Popeye's downfall didn't come from an enemy bullet, but from an intimate betrayal he had sown himself. A woman he had mistreated and forced into an abortion became an informant for the United States Anti-Narcotics Agency and used him as bait to get close to Pablo. The enforcer who coordinated armies of gunmen became, without knowing it, the lure in a personal revenge woven in silence. He surrendered to the authorities on October 9, 1992, convinced that prison would be safer than the street. He spent 23 years and 3 months behind bars, serving time for homicides, kidnappings, and his role in the Galán assassination. Throughout all that time, he never stopped talking, confessing, detailing what many preferred to bury. The man who lived off other people's silence became famous for his own tongue. He walked free in August of 2014 and lived one of the strangest second acts anyone can remember. He opened an internet channel to recycle his past into entertainment, gathered thousands of followers who treated him like a star, and even flirted with the idea of running for Congress. Thousands of people were paying, in a sense, to hear from his own mouth the darkest details of the cartel, as if proximity to horror were a spectacle and not an open wound in an entire country. He fed that morbid appetite without the slightest shame, even boasting that he had taken far more lives with his own hands than the boss himself. Justice came back for him in May of 2018, this time for extortion, and returned him to a cell. In April of 2020, stomach cancer that had already spread through his whole body ended his life at 57. The man who bragged about feeling nothing died consumed from the inside. But Popeye was not Pablo's first chief of gunmen. Before him there was another, younger and closer, and his fall was worth as much as the boss's own. Pinina, the boy who became an army. Jairo Arias Tascón was born in Medellin in 1961 into a family so poor that crime became his only social elevator. He was stealing at 12, leading a gang at 14, and shortly after he was already shooting on assignment in the hillsides of the city. His entry into the cartel was almost an accident of fate. He stole a car radio, and that insignificant theft ended up catching Escobar's own attention, who sent for him and recruited him. They called him Pinina because of his high, almost childlike voice, which recalled a character from a very popular soap opera of the time. Behind that sweet nickname hid one of the most lethal men Colombia has ever produced. The cartel had just found its architect of terror. What set Pinina apart wasn't shooting, but building human machines of violence. He was the one who built much of the cartel's military structure, the one who recruited, trained, and organized the gunmen who would later spread panic across the entire country. He was linked to the Los Priscos gang, that sinister office that turned young men from the neighborhoods with no future into professional enforcers for hire. He knew by heart every alley, every rooftop, and every exit route in the hillside districts of Medellin, a mental map that made him impossible to catch and impossible to replace. He wasn't just another soldier in the army. He was the man who manufactured the entire army. The whole city became his recruiting ground. To understand the real size of that structure, one image is enough. It's estimated that the cartel came to have at its disposal a network of around 2,000 gunmen spread across Medellin, a figure equivalent to a full military battalion operating in the shadows of a single city. Pinina didn't control them all, but he did direct a decisive portion of that force, and he was the one who designed many of its most delicate operations. Every neighborhood had its recruits, every recruit had a fixed price, and every price was paid on time to guarantee loyalty. That system turned an entire city into a factory of anonymous young men willing to do anything for a handful of bills. Terror had an org chart too, and he was the one drawing it. His closeness to the boss was of a different nature. It wasn't just obedience, but a long friendship going back to the earliest years when neither of them imagined the scale that all of it would reach. Pinina became a kind of chief of the personal guard and at the same time the coordinator of the most sensitive operations. When there was a strike from the state or from the cartel's enemies that had to be answered, Pablo went to him first. He handled money, he handled men, and he handled secrets, a combination that in that world meant holding the keys to the kingdom. His word could move hundreds of gunmen within a matter of hours. Few people in the organization concentrated so much power with so little public exposure. At 29, an age when most people are barely starting to live, Pinina commanded close to 2,000 gunmen. His name was tied to some of the crimes that marked an entire decade of mourning. The elimination of Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla in 1984, that of Governor Antonio Roldan Betancourt, that of Attorney General Carlos Mauro Hoyos, that of journalist Jorge Enrique Pulido. Authorities also pointed to him as an intellectual author of the attack on the DAS building in December of 1989, an explosion that shook downtown Bogotá and left dozens of victims, and they linked him to the attack on the Avianca plane. He held fifth place in the cartel's full hierarchy, and by that point, almost nobody in Medellin dared say his alias out loud. Pinina's end came in the early hours of June 13, 1990. The police elite corps located him in an apartment in the exclusive El Poblado neighborhood, where he was hiding with his wife and his 6-month-old daughter. He died in the confrontation, trapped in the one place where he felt safe. General Maza Marquez declared at the time that this fall carried exactly the same weight as capturing Escobar himself. Such was his real importance inside the cartel's machinery. The organization's answer didn't take even a day. 12 hours later, a car loaded with 80 kilos of dynamite exploded in that same neighborhood, leaving 4 dead and nearly 100 injured. The architect of terror was sent off with an explosion worthy of his own scale. The man who manufactured fear was ultimately devoured by it. The next one didn't fall in Medellin. He fell on the other side of the continent in a phone booth, and his sentence still hasn't ended. Quica, the man with 10 life sentences. Dandeny Muñoz Mosquera grew up in a large family, one of 15 siblings, the son of a former police officer who ended up becoming an evangelical pastor and of a woman who preached. Out of that house of prayer came one of the most feared gunmen of the cartel, as if fate had insisted on writing an irony. His brother, known as Tyson, also worked for Escobar, and for years Quica tried to hide behind that family coincidence, swearing that the real criminal was the other one and not him. But his name was already circulating in case files across half the world, repeated by witnesses and agents on 2 continents. The faith of that household wasn't enough to stop what came next. Unlike the boss's other men, Quica didn't limit himself to the familiar streets of Medellin. Escobar projected him as a weapon with international reach, capable of traveling, blending in, and carrying out operations far from home without raising suspicion. Colombian authorities linked him to the elimination of at least 50 police officers, judges, and public officials before he managed to flee the country. He was the kind of man you sent when a target seemed untouchable or too dangerous for anyone else. He moved coldly, spoke little, and struck first. His reputation always traveled faster than he did. The act that sealed his fate was the most brutal of all those attributed to the cartel. On November 27, 1989, A bomb exploded aboard Avianca Flight 203 in midair on the route connecting Bogota with Cali. All 107 people on board lost their lives, none of them having any connection to the cartel's war. The real objective was to eliminate presidential candidate Cesar Gaviria, who because of a last-minute decision hadn't even boarded that plane. To visualize the magnitude, imagine an entire apartment building with all its families asleep inside, vanishing in an instant because of an order given from kilometers away. 107 lives erased over a single target who wasn't even there. The sheer disproportion of that crime defines the cartel better than any statistic. The plane attack turned La Quica into a symbol of the darkest moment of that entire war, when the cartel stopped striking only its direct enemies and began attacking the population at random to force the government to break. It was the era of cars loaded with dynamite in crowded plazas, of bombs in shopping centers, of a country that learned to distrust any package left on a corner. The name Muñoz Mosquera was burned into that collective nightmare. For millions of Colombians, he represented the face of a terror that no longer distinguished between the guilty and the innocent. And that same terror would be, years later, the weight no lawyer would ever manage to lift off him. For years, La Quica denied any connection to that attack and to the Galan assassination, insisting that he had been convicted on false witnesses and fabrications. He claimed he had never placed a bomb on that plane and that he was paying for other men's crimes. But the evidence and the plea agreements of other people involved weighed far too heavily against him. He escaped twice from Colombian prisons, proving that no bars in the country could hold him. And it was precisely that talent for escaping that pushed him to look for refuge abroad. His mistake was believing he would go unnoticed overseas. The cartel's most elusive hunter got comfortable at the exact moment he was being watched most closely. On September 25, 1991, he was arrested in a phone booth in the Queens neighborhood of New York, carrying a false passport and barely $700 in his pocket. He was tried 3 times in a row. The first conviction was minor, for false documents and for lying to a federal agent. But in 1994, a federal court found him guilty, among many other charges, in the deaths of 2 American citizens who were traveling on that downed plane, and imposed 10 consecutive life sentences, a minimum of 160 years and a day behind bars. The judge went so far as to say that the defendant deserved something even worse because he wasn't only dangerous but seemed to have enjoyed committing his crimes. A sentence designed so that he would never see daylight again. He spent close to 15 years in total isolation, locked between 4 walls with barely any human contact, a punishment inside the punishment. More than 3 decades later, he remains held in a United States federal prison, swearing his innocence over and over and demanding documents that, according to him, would clear his name. And here appears the detail that connects this whole story to its ending. The recent public statements of one of Pablo's own nephews, the son of one of the men we haven't covered yet, reached the FBI and prompted a new review of that old case file. After so many years, a familiar voice out of nowhere moved pieces that seemed sealed. The bloodline of the clan reached his case file from a distance. All of these men carried out orders. The next one gave them, and he was the only one the police wanted to capture alive at any cost. Gustavo Gaviria, the lion who preferred the shadows. Gustavo de Jesus Gaviria Rivero, Pablo's first cousin, was born in 1946 and was, long before he was a partner, his companion in the crimes of their youth. Together they started from the bottom rung, in a Medellin where they stole cars, robbed movie theater box offices, and according to Escobar's own son, even took headstones from cemeteries to later demand money in exchange for returning them. From those almost picturesque thefts, they moved on to kidnappings, and from there to the business that would make them both immensely rich. They called him the Lion, and also the Doctor, for his cold and calculating way of solving everything. 2 cousins, one shared ambition from day one. What few accounts mention is that in the early years it was Gustavo who had the vision for the business even before Pablo did. While his cousin built a reputation as a man of the streets, he studied routes, contacts, and margins with the mind of a meticulous businessman. He understood before almost anyone else in Colombia that the real money wasn't in stealing, but in transporting illegal merchandise north on a scale nobody had dared to imagine. He built the invisible side of the operation, the planes, the clandestine airstrips, the discreet middlemen, the exact bribes at the exact points on the map. Pablo supplied the boldness, the charisma, and the hunger for the spotlight. Gustavo supplied the method, the caution, and the discipline of a man who counts every peso. Together they formed a single mind split across two bodies. One was the visible face, the other was the silent calculation. While Pablo collected headlines, statues, and enemies, Gustavo did exactly the opposite. He made himself invisible on purpose, and he did it as strategy. He was the financial and logistical brain of the cartel, the man who knew the international routes, the location of the laboratories, the suppliers of chemical products, and above all, the names and the accounts that moved the entire empire. A former agent of the United States Anti-Narcotics Agency put it bluntly years later. They wanted to capture Gaviria alive at all costs because he was the real brain, the only one who knew absolutely everything. His fortune was comparable to Pablo's, and even half of the legendary Hacienda Nápoles actually belonged to him. But his name almost never came to light, and that, precisely, was where his power lay. Gustavo loved to travel, especially to Europe, and moved around the world with the discreet elegance of any respectable businessman. He hated the noise, the cameras, and the crowds his cousin chased so eagerly. That's why he firmly opposed Pablo getting into politics, sensing clearly that such vanity would end up igniting a war impossible to win against the entire state. They argued about it more than once because Gustavo could see the abyss Pablo refused to look at. Time would prove him right in the worst possible way. Where Pablo saw glory, the lion only saw a countdown. The man who avoids the light lasts longer but rarely manages to stop the one chasing it. His weight inside the organization grew even more with time. When the other major kingpin, Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, known as the Mexican, was gunned down at the end of 1989, Gustavo automatically became the cartel's second man, the number 2 of the entire structure. He carried in his memory a colossal set of books that, in practice, only 2 people in the world knew in full: him and Pablo. That information made him, at the same time, the most indispensable and the most dangerous piece on the board. Capturing him alive meant stripping the entire empire bare, account by account. That's why he was, for the authorities, the biggest prize of that whole war. Gustavo's death, moreover, completely altered Pablo's character. He lost the only man who dared contradict him to his face, the brake that for years had moderated his most reckless decisions. Without that counterweight, the boss became even more unpredictable, more violent, and more obsessed with revenge at any price. Several of the darkest episodes of the entire war came right after that August, when there was no longer anyone with enough authority to tell him to stop. The lion had been, almost unnoticed from the outside, the voice of caution inside the empire. And when that voice went quiet, the empire started walking straight toward its own end. The lion's end came in August of 1990 in Medellin. Police located him inside a house in the Laureles neighborhood during a large-scale operation, at a moment when he was without escorts and accompanied by his family, confident that anonymity was still protecting him. He resisted and died under a hail of gunfire. He was buried in the Jardins Montesacro cemetery, very close to the place where, barely 3 years later, Pablo himself would rest. With his death, that mental ledger only 2 heads mastered was fragmented forever, and the empire began to fracture from within long before it collapsed from the outside. The police lost the witness who knew everything, and the cartel lost its backbone in a single afternoon. The man who avoided the light his entire life went out without the country ever really knowing who he had been. And now we reach the last one, the only one still alive, the one we saved for the end for a very specific reason. Roberto Escobar, the little bear who survived it all. Before becoming the accountant of a criminal empire, Roberto de Jesus Escobar Gaviria was a cyclist. His nickname, the Little Bear, was born mid-competition, in a storm, Mud covered his face until he was unrecognizable, and a journalist narrating the stage remarked, seeing him cross the finish line, that he looked like a small bear. That sweet nickname would follow him later through all his court proceedings, like a joke from fate. Before the war and the hidden stashes, Roberto was a prosperous man on his own merit. He built a bicycle factory that carried his name. He owned a 450-hectare estate, an almost obsessive passion for fine horses, and even a chain of motels. Pablo, still on the rise, sponsored his races and admired him. For years, nobody knew for certain whether the little bear truly knew about his brother's business. But by the mid-'80s, when the cartel became a money machine impossible to manage, Roberto found his exact place in the mechanism. His talent was never weapons, but numbers. He became the clan's accountant, the man who managed colossal sums of cash and designed the systems to hide it, move it and launder it in an era when the money was growing far faster than it could be counted or even stored. In official org charts, he was listed as head of finances, and he was also credited with a role in logistics and in the control of gunmen between 1987 and 1988. While the others spread fear in the streets, he balanced the uncountable in silence. The accounting brain rarely appears in the photos, but he holds up the whole building. The scale of the money that passed through his hands defies imagination. At the cartel's peak, the organization was bringing in amounts so absurd that the problem stopped being how to earn it and became literally how to physically hide it. There were stashes concealed in false walls, in the stables of country estates, buried underground, spread across hiding places only a handful of people knew about. Roberto was one of those few people. He carried in his head a treasure map that no paper recorded, because writing anything down meant leaving evidence for enemies and for the courts. It's said that the cartel lost enormous quantities of bills every year simply because rats gnawed at them in the warehouses or humidity ruined them before anyone could spend them. That remarkable memory made him an irreplaceable asset and at the same time a perfect target. When a man keeps in his head where an empire's money is, his head is worth as much as the empire itself. His comfort lasted exactly as long as Pablo's untouchable reign. When the empire started running and hiding, that was no longer the life Roberto had been born for. He turned himself in alongside his brother in mid-1991 and spent a year in La Catedral, that luxury prison Escobar himself had ordered, built entirely to his own specifications, with all the comforts of a mansion. From there, they escaped together when the government tried to transfer them. But the little bear wasn't built to run indefinitely through mountains and hideouts. In October of 1992, he decided to turn himself in again, this time with Pablo's express permission, who sincerely believed they would both be safer apart. He entered the maximum security prison of Itagüí, accused of money laundering and trafficking of substances. He thought that behind bars, at least, he would be safe from the crossfire. He was completely wrong. In 1993, while serving his sentence under guard, he received a manila envelope of harmless appearance, just like so many others. Inside there was no letter, but a bomb sent by Los Pepes, the clandestine group that had set out to destroy Escobar and everything that carried his family name. The charge detonated directly against his face as he opened it. The explosion destroyed the vital nerves of his eyes and perforated part of his inner ear. He survived by a miracle, but was left nearly blind, condemned to see the world only in blurs of black and white, and he lost around 70% of his hearing. Much of the remainder of his sentence was spent in a clinic room guarded day and night, recovering from an attack that had nearly wiped him off the map. And it was like that, half-blind and locked away, that he learned in December of that same year that his brother had been gunned down on a rooftop in Medellin. The entire empire was going dark while he was learning to live without being able to see. And here is the reason we saved his story for the very end. Of Pablo's 5 most trusted men, the little bear is the only true survivor, the last witness standing from a war that took down nearly everyone else. And he survived in large part because of one decision he kept to the letter for entire decades. Never inform on anyone. He never gave in to the countless offers to talk, to name the politicians who helped his brother or the beauty queens and models who paraded through La Catedral during that golden confinement. He would repeat that a real man answers only for what he does and lets others answer for their own, and that being an informant would never be part of his code. That absolute silence was at once his personal penance and his shield of survival. While others sang in exchange for reduced sentences, he swallowed every secret. The one who stays quiet pays dearly, but sometimes he stays quiet because he understands the price of noise. But fate had reserved for him an irony far greater than any revenge. Decades after that war, with all the protagonists dead or imprisoned, the public statements of his own son, Nicholas, about the true authorship of some of those crimes reached the FBI itself and prompted a review of one of the cartel's most emblematic cases, that of the plane brought down in 1989. The man who refused to talk his entire life, who turned silence into a religion, watched as the voice of his own bloodline stirred from a distance, and without him being able to stop it, a case file that seemed closed forever. What he sealed with decades of silence, his own descendant reopened with a few sentences. There are secrets that don't die with the man who keeps them. Over the years, the little bear tried to rebuild a life in the enormous shadow of his own family name. He wrote a memoir about his brother, gave interviews, and welcomed curious visitors from all over the world into the house where Pablo spent part of his final days, and where the dining table from that last family dinner is still preserved. He told his stories with the calm of a man who no longer fears anything, because he has seen death too closely too many times for it to frighten him. He insisted that he was still alive precisely because he never informed, because he honored to the very end the only code he truly respected. But behind that survivor's serenity was a man who can barely make out shapes, who depends on eye drops, and who counts his days in permanent dimness. The legend feeds many people, except the one who survived it. Today, Roberto Escobar lives with almost nothing, in a contradiction that seems impossible. The accountant who once managed figures no bank could have processed, who watched helicopters and private planes land at his family's service, can now barely make out the dark blurs crossing the sky when a plane passes over his house. While the entire world produces series, books, and documentaries that earn millions thanks to the Escobar name, practically none of that river of money reaches him. He was even close to signing a multi-million-dollar contract in Hollywood based on his own memoirs about the boss's life. But the deal fell apart between lawyers and broken promises. He tried to open a museum dedicated to his brother and couldn't even get that fully off the ground. The only one who survived the war, the bomb, and the oblivion is also the one who profited least from the myth he helped build. Surviving sometimes is the longest and quietest way of losing everything. 5 most trusted men, 5 irreconcilable fates born of the same ambition and the same blind loyalty. The enforcer who confessed died, consumed from the inside. The boy who manufactured armies fell at 29 in the one corner where he believed he was safe. The man with international reach is growing old in a cell on the other side of the world. The brain who avoided the light went out in the shadow he chose for himself. And the accountant who hid fortunes today can't make out the sky that once belonged to him. The empire that carried a single name was held up by hands that broke one by one.